To help understand dementia, you've really got to first understand how the brain develops and ages, and the factors that can affect that brain development and aging.
The risk factors for dementia include a couple of things that you can't really do much about. The biggest risk factor is actually growing old. The other thing that increases your risk is a family history of dementia, again, something you can't do much about. So anything that you do to decrease your risk of developing heart disease or strokes will probably decrease your risk of dementia. So things like treating high blood pressure, stopping smoking, making sure diabetes is well treated, avoiding obesity in midlife, which will actually precipitate diabetes. All these things will actually probably decrease your risk of developing dementia as well. There's a couple of things that may be more specific for developing dementia, and one of the major ones that we know about is head injury. The link between sporting injuries and sporting head injuries and later life problems has really come to the fore in the last few years. And there's a few sports that we particularly would be worried about. The one that we've known about for some time is boxing. People who have repeated injuries to their head in boxing are much more likely to develop a particular form of dementia. The other sports that are associated with relatively minor head injuries, but often frequent and continuing, are things like soccer, where the younger person may often be hitting the ball lots of times. People who have had long-standing alcohol use to very high amounts can have problems with the brain, which eventually can lead to dementia. We do know that long-term marijuana use can actually produce a particular type of problem involving the frontal lobes of somebody, and that can often lead to a loss of interest and energy.
There's still much that we don't know, but our knowledge is increasing rapidly, and there are some things you can be certain about. The human brain begins to form 3 weeks after conception and continues to develop for life. And keeping this development going looks like becoming one of the most important protective factors for avoiding dementia. The brain is made up of the cerebrum, which is the largest part and is responsible for controlling movement, recalling memories, problem solving, thinking and feeling. The cerebellum at the rear of your head and below the cerebrum is responsible for balance and coordination. The brain stem, which sits between the cerebrum and the cerebellum, connects the brain to your spinal cord. And the brainstem controls the automatic functions of your body, like breathing, your heart, keeping your blood pressure up, and digestion. To do all of this work, your brain requires a lot of blood, so it's not surprising that the most dense blood flow in your body is to the brain. In fact, around 20% of oxygen and nutrients, and that can increase up to 50% when you're thinking hard. So it's not surprising that the brain is vulnerable to interference with the blood supply. Now let's delve more deeply into how the brain works. It's divided into two halves. The left side controls movement on the right side of the body, and the right side controls the left. All over the brain's jelly-like surface, it has wrinkles. It's called the cortex, and what the science is showing us is that certain functions can be linked to specific areas of the cortex. For example, it can control sensations from your body like touch and taste, and interpret sights, sounds and smells. The cortex does your thinking, appears to generate thoughts and solve problems and make plans. The cortex creates and stores memories and controls voluntary movement. The real work of the brain is done by hundreds of billions of individual nerve cells called neurons, all working together in massively complex networks with more than 100 trillion connections or synapses. So this piece of jelly that fits in your hands and weighs less than 2 kilos is responsible for most of these functions that we would define as our humanity. And of course, part of being human is we age, chronologically and physically. And it's at this point that dementia can become apparent.
It's difficult to tell the difference between normal forgetting and the earliest signs of dementia. What I always like to tell people is that we reach our peak of cognitive functioning at about the age of 20. And from then on, we're all getting worse. We're all starting to forget a bit more.
She would, point to the birds sitting out in the backyard and say, these men are, still busy working in my backyard, and I'd really like to be able to, use the backyard and play with the dogs. And that was really scary because, the woman who was so much the centre of the family and very strong and independent and in control, and there were those sorts of things that really were more challenging for us than they were for her.
Behaviour changes associated with dementia are unpredictable and can come at any stage of the condition. So even people with quite mild memory problems can actually have quite a lot of behavioural changes. And it's incredibly distressing to families because they notice that this is more a change in the personality, that the person they've known all their lives has changed. The commonest behavioural change that people with dementia have is apathy, which is that the best way to describe it is their get up and go has gone.
She didn't want to go to tennis anymore. She had a few aches and pains, but she would go to golf. And then in the end, she didn't want to go to golf. And we noticed that she started to sleep a lot more. She said to us, my sisters and I, that she wanted to go into a nursing home. We were actually a little bit shocked and surprised. And she obviously knew in her head that things were falling apart. But she couldn't really tell us that in her own words. When she did get admitted into a nursing home, much to our surprise, it was like all the glue unstuck in her head and she just let go. So perhaps she may have had dementia longer than what we thought, but maybe living on her own, she had to keep it all together.